On January 25, 2026, at 7:45 p.m., a Bombardier Challenger 650 carrying 6 people attempted takeoff from Bangor International Airport in Maine during what air traffic control described as heavy snow and freezing fog. Visibility, 3/4 of a mile. Temperature, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft had spent 20 minutes at the desing pad before taxiing to runway 33, but 45 seconds after receiving clearance, the controller transmitted, "Aircraft upside down. All 6 died." I've studied the ATC recordings, the ADSB data, the weather reports. Here's what doesn't add up. Multiple crews that evening made different assessments of the same conditions. One airline crew aborted, citing failed desing. The Challenger crew proceeded. Were the actual conditions on the runway different from what was being reported? The understanding what happened in those 45 seconds might save lives. The evening of January 25, 2026, found Bangor International Airport in the early stages of Winter Storm Fern, a system that would eventually dump over 10 inches of snow across central Maine. At 7:45 p.m. local time, conditions at the airport included heavy snow and freezing fog with visibility reduced to 3/4 of a mile. Surface temperatures hovered around 2 degrees Fahrenheit with severe wind chill. Winds were light. The National Weather Service had issued winter storm warnings predicting significant accumulation overnight. The Bombardier Challenger 650, registered as N10KJ, was a business jet configured for transcontinental travel with seating for 9 passengers. The aircraft was owned by an LLC registered to the same Houston address as Arnold and Itkin Trial Lawyers. On board were 6 people: Captain Jacob Hosmer, 47, who had joined the firm as a corporate pilot 8 months earlier, an unnamed co-pilot, and 4 passengers, including Tara Arnold, 46, an attorney and wife of firm founder Kurt Arnold, Shauna Collins, an event planner, Nick Mastroscusa, father of 3 from Hawaii, and at least one other passenger whose identity hasn't been publicly confirmed. The flight plan called for a stop in Bangor to refuel before continuing to Paris. The aircraft had arrived from Houston at 6:09 p.m., sitting on the ramp for over an hour as fuel was loaded and snow began falling more heavily. By the time the crew was ready to depart, conditions were marginal, but within legal limits. The airport remained open. Commercial flights continued operating. Multiple aircraft had departed successfully in the preceding hours. Everything looked normal, until it wasn't. The Challenger's preparation for departure unfolded during a critical window when weather conditions were actively deteriorating. Around 7:15 p.m., that's approximately 30 minutes before the crash, an Allegiant Airlines crew preparing for a Florida-bound departure made a decision that would, in retrospect, prove significant. According to audio captured by liveitc.net, the Allegiant pilot reported that their desing operation had failed and visibility wasn't adequate for departure. The tower controller acknowledged, noting he was about to warn the crew that visibility had dropped to approximately 3/4 of a mile. That crew chose to return to the gate. The Challenger crew, monitoring the same frequency, would have heard this exchange. They understood conditions were marginal. Their response was methodical: taxi to the desing pad for treatment. The aircraft remained there for approximately 20 minutes while crews applied heated glycol-based fluids designed to remove existing contamination and provide temporary protection against reaccumulation. After desing was complete, the Challenger taxied to runway 33. The crew received takeoff clearance. In the cockpit, standard callouts would have been made as the engine spooled up. V1, the go/no-go decision speed around 125 to 130 knots for this aircraft weight. VIR, rotation speed near 135 to 140 knots where the pilot pulls back to lift the nose. The aircraft began accelerating down the runway, its landing lights illuminating falling snow, the windscreen wipers working to maintain visibility. The crew had committed to flight, but the runway surface and the air above it held conditions that would prove catastrophic. Flight tracking data shows the Challenger reached approximately 152 knots ground speed, roughly 175 miles per hour, before the sequence of events that ended in tragedy. The aircraft rotated, lifting its nose wheel off the pavement. For a brief moment, it was airborne. Then something went catastrophically wrong. Preliminary findings indicate the aircraft crashed under unknown circumstances on departure, veering right before it came to rest inverted and caught fire. The final ADSB position showed the aircraft off the right side of runway 33, having traveled approximately a mile and a half from the point where takeoff clearance was issued. Though in the cockpit during those final seconds, the crew would have experienced sensations that suggested asymmetric lift, one wing producing more lift than the other. the aircraft would have begun rolling unexpectedly. Standard responses would have been immediate. Opposite aileron to counter the roll, rudder to maintain directional control, advanced thrust on the working engine if one side was producing more power. But if contamination had compromised the wing's ability to generate lift, those inputs might have been insufficient or even counterproductive. The sensation in a contaminated wing stall is distinctively different from a clean stall. The aircraft doesn't mush gradually toward the ground. It snaps, rolling sharply as one wing loses lift before the other. At low altitude, immediately after rotation, and when airspeed is just above minimum flying speed, there simply isn't enough altitude or energy to recover. The physics become unforgiving. Approximately 45 seconds after the Challenger received takeoff clearance, an air traffic controller's voice came across the frequency. All traffic is stopped on the field. All traffic is stopped on the field. Moments later, aircraft upside down. We have a passenger aircraft upside down. The aircraft had rolled inverted and come to rest on or near the runway. Fire erupted immediately as thousands of pounds of jet fuel ignited in the sub-zero temperatures. First responders arrived within a minute, according to Airport Director Jose Saavedra. Fire and rescue teams from the Bangor Fire Department and approximately 10 other municipalities responded, but the crash was unsurvivable. All 6 people aboard, the 2 pilots and 4 passengers, died in the accident. None were transported to the hospital. The families waiting in Paris never received word of arrival. In Houston, Kurt Arnold learned his wife wouldn't be coming home. 3 children lost their father, a daughter lost her mother, friends lost friends. The physical evidence would tell investigators much about the final moments: the aircraft's position, the pattern of wreckage, the fire damage, the condition of control surfaces. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, if they survived the fire, would provide even more detail. But the fundamental question remained unanswered in those first hours and days. What caused a professionally crewed, properly maintained business jet to lose control 45 seconds after receiving takeoff clearance? The data tells us what happened. The question is why? The leading theory emerged within hours of the accident, grounded in both the aircraft type's documented history and the prevailing weather conditions: wing contamination. Aviation safety expert Jeff Gazzetti told the Associated Press that the Bombardier Challenger 600 series has a history of problems with icing on takeoff and is very susceptible to ice contamination on the upper wing surface. The aerodynamic principles are unforgiving. Ice or frost on a wing, even a layer as thin as coarse sandpaper, disrupts the smooth airflow that generates lift. The contamination causes the boundary layer of air flowing over the wing to separate prematurely, dramatically reducing lift and increasing drag. Studies have shown that even minor contamination can reduce lift by 30% and increase drag by 40%. More critically, the wing's stall angle, the angle of attack at which it stops producing lift and the aircraft drops, decreases significantly. During rotation, the pilot increases the wing's angle of attack to generate the lift needed to fly. But if contamination is present, the wing may reach its degraded stall angle before achieving safe flying speed. What makes this particularly dangerous is that contamination rarely affects both wings equally. One wing stalls first, creating an asymmetric roll that accelerates rapidly. At low altitude with minimal airspeed, recovery is virtually impossible. The Challenger had undergone 20 minutes of dacing treatment. But the critical question becomes, was the aircraft still clean when it attempted takeoff? Dacing fluid provides temporary protection called holdover time, the period during which the fluid can prevent ice accumulation. That time varies dramatically based on precipitation type and intensity. A second theory centers on a phenomenon called cold-soaked fuel icing, less discussed in initial media coverage but potentially significant given the circumstances. When aircraft refuel with jet fuel stored in underground tanks during winter, that fuel can be at or near freezing temperature. Pumping thousands of pounds of sub-zero fuel into wing tanks chills the wing's aluminum structure from the inside. Here's where the physics become treacherous. Snow falling on a wing that's been chilled by cold fuel doesn't just accumulate, it can melt slightly from aerodynamic heating during taxi, then immediately refreeze as clear ice when it contacts the supercooled metal. This creates contamination that's nearly invisible during pre-flight inspections. Frost is easy to see. It's white and granular. Clear ice is transparent and smooth, potentially going undetected, especially at night during falling snow. The NTSB has documented previous accidents where cold-soaked fuel contributed to post-dicing contamination. The timing becomes critical. If the Challenger was refueled shortly after landing at 6:09 p.m., the thermal mass of thousands of pounds of cold fuel would have kept the wing structure cold throughout the dacing operation and beyond. The desing fluid removes existing contamination and provides temporary protection, but it doesn't warm the wing. If snow continued falling on a supercooled surface during taxi, recontamination could occur despite proper dicing procedures. The investigation will examine several key data points: fuel temperature at the Bangor fuel farm that evening, exactly when refueling occurred, how much fuel was added, and the time elapsed between refueling and attempted takeoff. A third possibility warrants examination: the challenge of assessing actual runway conditions versus reported conditions. Weather observation is standardized. Airports report visibility, ceiling, temperature, precipitation type, and intensity, but those observations represent a snapshot from a specific location. Typically, the airport's automated weather observation system or the tower controller's perspective. The actual conditions at different points on the airport surface can vary. Falling snow at 2 degrees Fahrenheit behaves differently than snow at 28 degrees. At the colder temperature, snow crystals are smaller, drier, and more likely to blow and drift. They can accumulate on surfaces more readily. They're also more likely to be mixed with ice crystals rather than traditional snowflakes. The distinction matters aerodynamically. Additionally, local effects can create variations. A runway with poor drainage might have different surface conditions than one with excellent drainage. Wind patterns can cause snow to accumulate more heavily on one side of a runway than another. The precipitation intensity can change minute by minute as snow bands move through. The question becomes, were the conditions at the point where the Challenger rotated different from what the crew assessed during their pre-takeoff checks? If snow intensity increased during their taxi, or if local accumulation patterns created contamination that wasn't visible during the walk-around inspection, the crew might have proceeded with incomplete information about the actual threat they faced. The investigation will likely examine whether radar data, surface observations from multiple locations, and any video footage that might show precipitation. Intensity changes during the critical time window. When I examine the totality of available evidence, wing contamination emerges as the most probable proximate cause, but with important qualifiers. The Challenger 650's documented susceptibility to icing, the environmental conditions conducive to contamination, the aircraft's behavior during takeoff, rolling inverted suggests asymmetric lift, all point toward a wing stall during or immediately after rotation. But the deeper question is, why did contamination exist despite proper desing procedures? Several factors likely contributed: cold-soaked fuel chilling the wings from inside, making them susceptible to recontamination; potential underestimation of how quickly conditions were deteriorating; the challenge of detecting clear ice during a nighttime pre-contamination check; and possibly expired holdover time between desing completion and takeoff attempt. The Allegiant crew's decision to abort provides a critical data point. Thus, that crew recognized their dacing had failed. Their pre-contamination check revealed roughness or contamination on the wings. They also assessed visibility as inadequate. These weren't arbitrary decisions. They reflected professional judgment that conditions had crossed a safety threshold. The Challenger crew apparently reached a different conclusion. Their pre-contamination check suggested the aircraft was clean. Other jets were departing. The tower hadn't closed the runway, but in retrospect, multiple signals suggested conditions were more hazardous than standard assessments indicated. The NTSB investigation will focus on exactly what contamination was present, how it formed despite desing, and why it wasn't detected. But there's something else that's been bothering me about the crew's decision-making process. And in the Challenger cockpit, Captain Hosmer faced decisions that would determine whether 6 people lived or died, with incomplete information and time pressure. He'd been with Arnold and Itkin for 8 months, enough time to establish procedures and build experience with the aircraft, but perhaps not enough to develop the deep pattern recognition that comes from years of winter operations at challenging airports. The cognitive environment would have been complex. Passengers ready to depart for Paris. Weather marginal but legal. Other aircraft continuing to operate successfully. The Allegiant abort providing a warning, but that crew flew a different aircraft type with different dicing requirements. The decision to proceed after thorough desing suggests the crew believed they'd adequately addressed the threat. But simulator training rarely captures the full complexity of winter operations. Simulators can replicate degraded aircraft performance, the sluggish controls, the reduced climb capability, but they can't replicate the sensory challenge of conducting a proper pre-contamination check in darkness at 2 degrees Fahrenheit with snow falling. They can't replicate the subtle pressure of schedule expectations when passengers are aboard, fuel is loaded, clearance is received, and the runway is available. The gap between training scenarios and operational reality becomes starkest in these marginal conditions. Pilots train for binary situations: contaminated or clean, go or no go. Operations present gradients and ambiguities. How do you assess whether contamination detected after dicing represents acceptable roughness or unacceptable hazard? When do external signals, another crew aborting, visibility dropping, outweigh your own assessment that conditions are manageable? The Bombardier Challenger 650 represents an evolution of the Challenger 600 series that first flew in 1980. More than 1,000 aircraft in this family have been delivered, making it one of the most successful business jet designs. The type is known for its spacious cabin, transcontinental range, and relatively economical operating costs for its size. But it also has a documented vulnerability. In 2008, the FAA issued an airworthiness directive requiring specific warnings in the flight manual for Challenger 600 aircraft regarding winter weather and takeoff safety. The directive followed 3 incidents in Canada where crews lost control during takeoff in cold weather. According to the FAA, even small amounts of ice, frost, or slush on the wings could cause loss of control during takeoff. Aviation consultant Jeff Gazzetti noted that previous Challenger 600 crashes with similar profiles occurred in past decades. The 2008 directive was intended to heighten pilot awareness, but it didn't mandate design changes or enhance desing procedures. The question for investigators: did the directive adequately address the vulnerability, or does this accident reveal that additional measures are needed? Bombardier issued a statement expressing condolences and committing to support the investigation, but provided no technical commentary pending NTSB findings. The accident exposes tensions inherent in winter weather operations. Bangor International Airport remained open because, from a regulatory standpoint, conditions were within acceptable parameters. Visibility at 3/4 of a mile exceeded minimums. Winds were light. Runway treatment crews were actively working. Commercial operations continued. From the tower's perspective, the airport was managing the weather event professionally. But regulatory minimums represent legal thresholds, not necessarily safe conditions for all aircraft types in all situations. The Challenger's specific vulnerability to wing contamination meant that conditions acceptable for other aircraft types might not be safe for it. This creates a cognitive challenge. All external cues, airport open, other planes departing, clearances being issued, suggest operations are normal, yet aircraft-specific factors may require more conservative decision-making. Story Parton 91. Business aviation operations also lack the layered safety systems of scheduled airlines. There's no dispatcher independently assessing weather. There's no chief pilot reviewing go/no-go decisions. The flight crew bears sole responsibility, often with schedule pressures that airlines might be better positioned to absorb. When passengers are waiting, fuel is loaded, and departure is expected, the psychological pressure to proceed is significant, even when conditions are marginal. The systemic question: should aircraft with documented cold weather vulnerabilities face different operational restrictions than those without such histories? Should the presence of certain aircraft types trigger different weather assessment protocols? Every accident is a chain of events. But break one link, mandate more conservative operations for vulnerable aircraft types, require independent weather assessment for Part 91 operations, enhance holdover time guidance for extreme cold, and 6 people might have chosen to wait out the storm. For pilots operating in winter conditions, especially those flying aircraft with known cold weather sensitivities, this accident demands renewed commitment to conservative decision-making. First, know your aircraft's vulnerabilities. If you're flying a Challenger 600 series or any type with documented icing issues, treat cold weather operations as high-risk events requiring extra margins. The 2008 FAA directive exists because this aircraft type has demonstrated specific susceptibility. Second, perform thorough tactile pre-contamination checks. Visual inspections in darkness with falling snow are insufficient. Run your hand across the wing's leading edge and upper surface. Any roughness, even slight granularity that might feel trivial, represents contamination that can be aerodynamically catastrophic. If there's any doubt, return for retreatment. Third, treat holdover times as hard limits, not suggestions. When precipitation is falling, calculate from the moment desing is complete. Factor in taxi time. If you're approaching the limit, request immediate takeoff priority or return to dacing. Schedule pressure is never worth the risk. Fourth, recognize that weather assessment is imperfect. Reported conditions represent a snapshot from a specific location. Actual conditions at your rotation point may differ. When other crews are aborting, especially experienced airline crews at their home airport, treat it as a critical warning that conditions may be worse than standard reports suggest. Finally, practice saying no. In business aviation, you're often the only safety voice. Passengers waiting, fuel loaded, clearance received. None of that matters if conditions exceed safe margins. The right decision isn't always the popular one. 6 people died at Bangor. Tara Arnold, 46, Tulane law graduate and attorney who dedicated her practice to helping offshore accident victims. Shauna Collins, event planner remembered as a light that brightened those around her. Nick Mastroscusa, father of 3 from Hawaii, known for kindness and dedication. Captain Jacob Hosmer, 47, loving husband and father who friends described as always kind, always laughing. And 2 others whose families mourn them. These weren't statistics. They were people heading to Paris for a weekend together, professionals doing their jobs, individuals with families expecting them home. Harris County Commissioner Leslie Briones, who knew the Arnolds, remembered Tara as a phenomenal person, a bold leader, and somebody who had a heart of service. These memories matter. The investigation will take up to a year. A preliminary report should arrive within a month. Final findings with probable cause determination will take longer. When those reports arrive, they'll contain recommendations about cold weather operations and contamination detection. We owe these 6 people more than analysis. We owe them prevention. The fragility of flight, that invisible contamination can defeat decades of engineering and training, demands humility and vigilance. Understanding what happened in those 45 seconds might save the next crew facing similar conditions. This channel will follow the investigation and provide updates as findings emerge. The responsibility of those who fly is to learn from every accident, ensuring that losses lead to improvements that prevent future tragedies.